The Joe Rogan Experience.
But I think if I was in the future, some weird dystopian future where artificial intelligence runs everything and human beings are, linked to some sort of neurological implant that connects us all together, and we long for the days of biological independence, and we would like to see what was it like when they first started inventing phones? What was it like when the internet was first opened up for people? What was it like when people saw when someone had someone like you on a podcast and was talking about potential artificial intelligence and where it could lead us and what it could do?
It's the most interesting time.
It is the most interesting time. Yeah. That's what's cool about it to me, is that we seem to be in this really Goldilocks period of great change where we're still human, but we're worried about privacy. We're concerned our phones are listening to us. We're concerned about surveillance states, and people put little stickers over the laptop camera. We see it coming, but it hasn't quite hit us yet. We're just seeing the problems that are associated with this increased level of technology in our lives.
Which is, that is a strange thing. If we add up all these pieces, it does put us in this very weirdly special position.
Yeah.
And you wonder, it's a little bit too much of a coincidence. I mean, it might be the case, but it does put some strain on it.
When you say a little too much of a coincidence, how so?
So, I guess the intuitive way of thinking about it, what are the chances that just by chance you would happen to be living in the most interesting time in history, being like a celebrity, like whatever, that's pretty low prior probability. Like most people,
like for me?
Well, from you, I mean, but for all of us, really. And so that could just be. I mean, if there's a lottery, somebody's got to have the ticket, right?
Yeah.
But
or
we are wrong about this whole picture, and there is some very different structure in place.
That's
which would make our experiences more typical.
That's what I was getting to.
Yeah, I gathered.
Yeah. So, how much have you considered the possibility of a simulation?
Well, a lot. I mean, I developed the simulation argument.
Yes.
Back in the early 2000s, and so
but I mean, I know that you developed this argument, and I know that you've spent a great deal of time working on this. But personally, the way you view the world, how much does it play into your vision of what reality is?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, for the majority of my time, I'm not actively thinking about that. I'm just living. And now I have this weird, my work is actually to think about big picture questions. So it kind of comes in through my work as well. When you're trying to make sense of our position, our possible future prospects, the levers which we might have available to affect the world, what would be a good and bad way of pulling those levers, then you have to try to put all of these constraints and considerations together. And in that context, I think it's important. I think if you are just going about your daily existence, then it might not really be very useful or relevant to constantly try to bring in hypotheses about the nature of our reality and stuff like that. Because for most of the things you're doing on a day-to-day basis, they work the same, whether it's inside a simulation or in basement level physical reality. You still need to get your car keys out, you still need to, right? So in some sense, it kind of factors out and is irrelevant for many practical intents and purposes.
Do you remember when you started to contemplate the possibility of a simulation?
No, I mean, I remember when the simulation argument occurred to me, which is less, it's not just, I mean, for as long as I can remember, maybe it's a possibility, it could all be a dream, it could be a simulation, but that there is this specific argument that kind of narrows down the range of possibilities, and where the simulation hypothesis is then one of only three kind of options.
What are the three options?
Well, one is that there is almost all civilizations at our current stage of technological development go extinct before reaching technological maturity. That's like option one. Kind of would be bad
Could you
news.
define technological maturity?
Well, say having developed at least all those technologies that we already have good reason to think are physically possible.
Okay.
So that would include the technology to build extremely large and powerful computers on which you could run detailed computer simulations of conscious individuals. So that kind of would be a pessimistic high. Like if almost all civilizations at our stage failed to get there, that's bad news, right? Because then we'll fail as well, almost certainly.
That's one possibility.
Yeah, so that's option one. Option two is that there is a very strong convergence among all technologically mature civilizations in that they all lose interest in creating ancestor simulations or these kinds of detailed computer simulations of conscious people like their historical predecessors or variations. So maybe they have all of these computers that could do it, but for whatever reason, they all decide not to do it. Maybe there's an ethical imperative not to do it or some other. I mean, we don't really know much about these post-human creatures and what they want to do and don't want to do. So
post-human creatures.
Well, I'd imagine that by the time they have the technology to do this,
yes,
they would also have enhanced themselves in many different ways.
Right.
And so
perhaps enhancing their ability to recognize the consequences of creating some sort of a simulation.
Yeah, they would almost certainly have cognitively enhanced themselves, for example.
Well, is the concept of downloading consciousness into a computer, it almost ensures that there's going to be some type of simulation. If you have the ability to download consciousness into a computer, once it's contained into this computer, what's to stop it from existing there as long as there's power and as long as these chips are firing and electricity is being transferred and data is being moved back and forth, you would essentially be in some sort of a simulation.
Well, I mean, if you have the capability to do that and also the motive.
It would have to simulate something that resembles some sort of a biological interface. Otherwise, it's not going to know what to do, right?
Yeah. So we have these kind of virtual reality environments now that are imperfect but improving.
Yes.
And you could kind of imagine that they get better and better, and then you have a perfect virtual reality environment. But imagine also that your brain, instead of sitting in a box with big headphones and some glasses on, like the brain itself also could be part of the simulation.
The Matrix.
Well, I think in the Matrix there are biological humans outside that plug in, right?
Right.
But if you could include in the simulation, just as you have maybe simulated coffee mugs and cars, etc., you could have simulated brains. That here is one assumption coming in from outside the simulation argument, and one can talk about it separately, but it's the idea that I call it the substrate independence thesis, that you could in principle have conscious experiences implemented on different substrate. It doesn't have to be carbon atoms, as is the case with the human brain. It could be silicon atoms. That what creates conscious experiences is some kind of structural feature of the computation that is being performed, rather than the material that is used to underpin it. So in that case, you could have a simulation with detailed simulations of brains in it, where maybe every neuron and synapse is simulated, and then those brains would be conscious.
And that's possibility number two?
Well, no. So possibility number two is that these post-humans just are not at all interested in doing it. And not just that some of them don't do it, but like of all these civilizations that reach technological maturity, there's kind of pretty uniformly just don't do that.
And what's number three?
That we are in a simulation, the simulation hypothesis.
And where do you lean?
Well, I generally tend to punt on the question of precise probabilities there. I mean, I think it would be a probability thing, right?
Yes.
It assigns some to each. Mm-hmm. But I've refrained from giving a very precise number, partly because, I mean, if I said some particular number, it would get quoted and it would create this maybe sense of false precision. Mm-hmm. The argument doesn't allow you to derive the probability is X, Y, Z. It's just that at least one of these three has to obtain. So that narrows it down. Like, because you might think, what do we know? The future is big. You could just make up any story, and we have no evidence for it. But it seems that there are actually, if you start to think everything through, quite tight constraints on what probabilistically coherent views you could have, and it's kind of hard even to find one overall hypothesis that fits this and various other considerations that we think we know.
The idea would be that if there is one day the ability to create a simulation, that it would be indiscernible from reality itself. That if, like, say if we are not in a simulation yet, if this is just biological life, we're just extremely fortunate to be in this Goldilocks period, but we're working on virtual reality in terms of like Oculus, and all these companies are creating these consumer-based virtual reality things that are getting better and better and really kind of interesting. That you got to imagine that 20 years ago there was nothing like that. 20 years from now, it might be indiscernible. You might be able to create a virtual reality that's impossible to discern from the reality that we currently experience.
Or maybe 20,000 years or 20 million years. Like the argument makes no assumption at all about how long it will take.
Yeah. But one day, if things continue to improve, computational power, the ability to replicate experiences and even feedback in terms of like biological feedback, touch and feel and smell, if they figure out a way to do that, one day they will have an artificial reality that's indiscernible from reality itself. And if that is the case, how do we know if we're in it?
Right. That is roughly the gist of it. Now, as I said, I think if you simulate the brain also, you have a cheaper overall system than if you have a biological component in the center surrounded by virtual reality gear. So you could, for a given cost, I think, create many more ancestor simulations with simulated brains in them rather than biological brains with VR gear. So most in these scenarios where there would be a lot of simulations, most of those scenarios, which would be the kind of where everything is digital, because it's just cheaper with mature technology to do it that way.
This is one of the biggest, for lack of a better terms, mind fucks. When you really stop and think about reality itself, that if we are living in a simulation, like what is it, and why, and where does it go, and how do I respond? How do I move forward? If I really do believe this is a simulation, what am I doing here?
Yeah, those are big questions.
Huge questions.
And some of them arise even if we're not in a simulation.
Yeah. And aren't there people that have done some strange, impossible to understand calculations that are designed to determine whether or not there's a likelihood of us being involved in a simulation currently?
Yeah, I think it slightly misses the point. So I think there are these attempts to try to figure out the computational requirements that would be required if you wanted to simulate some physical system with perfect precision. So if we have some human, a brain, a room, let us say, and we wanted to simulate every little part, every atom, every subatomic particle, the whole quantum wave function, what would be the computational load of that? And would it be possible to build a computer powerful enough that you could actually do this? Now, I think the way that this misses the point is that it's not necessary to simulate all the details of this environment that you want to create in an ancestor simulation. You would only have to simulate it insofar as it is perceptible to the observer inside the simulation. So if some post-human civilization wanted to create a Joe Rogan doing a podcast simulation, they'd need to simulate Joe Rogan's brain, because that's where the experiences happen. And then whatever parts of the environment that you are able to perceive. So surface appearances, maybe of the table and walls. Maybe they would need to simulate me as well, or at least a good enough simulacrum that I could sort of spit out words that would sound like they came from a real human, right? I don't know. Now we're getting quite good with this GPT-2, like this kind of AI that just spews out words with I don't know whether. Anyway, so you'd have, but like what is happening inside this table right now is completely irrelevant. You have no idea of knowing whether there even are atoms there. Now you could take a big electron microscope and look at finer structure, and then you could take an atomic force microscope and you could see individual atoms even, and you could perform all kinds of measurements. And it might be important that if you did that, you wouldn't see anything weird, because physicists do these experiments and they don't see anything weird. But then you could kind of fill in those details, like if and when somebody were performing those experiments. That would be vastly cheaper than continuously running all of this. And so this is the way a lot of computer games are designed today, that they have a certain rendering distance. Like you only like actually simulate the virtual world when the character goes close enough that you could see it.
Right.
And so imagine these kind of super intelligent post-humans doing this. Obviously, they would have figured that out and a lot of other optimizations. So these, in other words, these calculations or experiments, I think, don't really tell on the hypothesis.
Without assigning a probability to either one of those three scenarios, what makes you think if you do stop and think, I think we're in a simulation, what are the things that are convincing to you?
Well, it would mainly go through the simulation argument that if to the extent that I think the alternative two hypotheses are improbable, then that would kind of shift the probability mass on the third remaining.
Is it really only three? So the ones are that human beings go extinct.
Well, and also other civilizations
right.
at our stage in the cosmos or whatever.
Yes.
It's a strong filter.
That they either go extinct or they decide not to pursue it.
They all lose interest, yeah.
Or it becomes a simulation. Is that really the only three
well,
options?
I think the only three live options. Now, so you can kind of unfold the argument a little bit more and look more granular. So suppose that the first two options are false. So some non-trivial fraction of civilizations at our stage do get through. And some non-trivial fraction of those are still interested. Then I think you can convincingly show that by using just a small portion of their resources, they could create very, very many simulations. And you can show that or argue for that by comparing the computational power of systems that we know are physically possible to build. We can't currently build them, but we could see that you could build them with nanotech and if you have planetary-sized resources. On the one hand, and on the other hand, estimates of how much compute power it would take to simulate a human brain. And you find that a mature civilization would have many, many orders of magnitude more. So that even if they just used 1% of their compute power of one planet for 1 minute, they could still run, thousands and thousands and thousands of these simulations. And they might have billions of planets and they might last for billions of years. So the numbers are quite extreme, it seems. So then what you get is this implication that if the first two options are false, it would follow that there would be many, many more simulated experiences of our kind than there would be original experiences of our kind.
So the idea is that if we continue to innovate, if human beings or intelligent life in the cosmos continues to innovate, that creating a simulation is almost inevitable?
No. I mean, the second might be...
that we decide not to.
Yeah, and others with the same capability.
But what if they don't decide not to?
Well,
if they don't decide to not choose... the first option, if human beings do figure out a way to not die and stay innovative and we don't have any sort of natural disasters or man-made created disasters, then step two, if we don't decide to not pursue this, if we continue to pursue all various forms of technological innovation, including simulations, that it becomes inevitable. If we get past those two first options, it becomes inevitable that we pursue it.
Well, so if they have the capacity,
then they will do it.
And the motive,
and
or
the
like
resources.
the desire to use
Yes.
it. Yeah, so that then that would create hugely many of these. So not just one simulation, right? But
Infinite.
Because it's so cheap at technological maturity, if you have a cosmic empire of resources, They don't have to have a very big desire to do this. They might just think, well,
Well, that was the big question that Elon said he would ask artificial intelligence. He said, what's beyond the simulation?
Okay.
That's the real question. If this is a simulation, if there's many, many simulations running currently, what's beyond the simulation?
Well, yeah, you might be curious about that. I mean, I think the more important question would be like, what do we, all things considered, have the most reason to do in our situation? Like, what would it be wise for us to do? Is there like some way that we can be helpful or have the best life, or whatever your goal is?
Or is that ridiculous to even consider? Maybe it's beyond us.
What the question of what is outside?
Yes.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's ridiculous to consider. I think it might be beyond us, but maybe we would be able to form some abstract conception of what it is. I mean, in fact, if the path to believing the simulation hypothesis is the simulation argument, then I mean we have a bunch of structure there that gives us some idea. Like there would be some advanced civilization that would have developed a lot of technology over time, including compute technology, ability to do virtual reality very well. We'd imagine probably they would have used that technology for a whole host of other purposes as well. You wouldn't just get that technology and not be able to create a train or something like that. So right. They'd probably be super intelligent and have the ability to colonize the universe and do a whole host of other things. And then for one reason or another, they would have decided to use some of the resources to create simulations. And inside one of those simulations, perhaps our experiences would be taking place. And then you could more speculatively fill in more details there, but I still think that fundamentally, our ability to grok this whole thing would be very limited, and there might be other considerations that we are oblivious to that would change. I mean, if you think about the simulation argument, it's quite recent, right? So it's less than 20 years old. So if you think that, so suppose it's correct for the sake of argument, then up to this point, everybody was missing something like hugely important and fundamental.
Yeah.
Right? Really smart people, hundreds of years, like just like this massive piece right in the center. But what's the chances that we now have figured out the last big missing piece? Like presumably, there must be some further big giant realization that is like beyond us currently. So I think having some. Yeah, I mean, that looks kind of plausible, but maybe there are further big discoveries or revelations that would kind of maybe not falsify the simulation, but maybe change the interpretation, or like do something that is hard to know in advance what that would be.
Now, is the concept that if there is a simulation that all of the historical record is simulated as well?
Well,
or when did it kick in?
Well, so there are different options there, right? And there might be many different simulations that are configured differently. There could be ones that run for a very long time, ones that run for a short period of time, ones that simulate everything and everybody, others that just focus on some particular scene or person. You could it's just a vast space of possibilities there. And which ones of those would be most likely is really hard to say much about, because it would depend on the reasons for creating these simulations. Like, what would the interests of these hypothetical post-humans be?